The diner smelled of scorched coffee and bacon grease at 10 minutes to 6. The first customer walked in and blamed it on the fryer. Ren Castellane was 19 years old, and she had learned to count money the way other people counted breaths. Without looking down at one, she had $10.40. Nineteen it twice already this morning, once in the car and once here. Spread flat on the counter under the register light, because counting yang felt like something to do with her hands. The vinyl booth behind her was cold enough that she could feel it through her uniform. When she leaned back, a hairline crack in the seat, pressing a thin line into her elbow. The fryer clicked on somewhere behind the counter, a low mechanical hum that filled the silence before she'd even turned to look at it, before she'd noticed the grey light coming up outside the window over the parking lot. In her apron pocket, her hip, was a brass compass that had belonged to her grandfather, and to his father before that, the casing worn smooth in a spot that fit her thumb exactly. She hadn't decided yet out it because she missed him, or because she hadn't figured out where else to put it. 6 feet away, her manager counted a bank deposit into a canvas both hands, and never once looked at dollars. People stop noticing you once they decide you don't need anything, Ren thought, and went back to folding napkins on a cot that didn't fit him, because 6 weeks after their grandfather's funeral, not nothing about their lives had been settled. Not the house, not the will, not where either of them was supposed to be. Her phone rang against the counter. A woman's voice, flat and loud together, asking if she and her brother could come in together. There was a property. The woman said that needed what kind of property. She already knew the coat her grandfather wore every day for 20 years, patched twice at the elbow. What exactly had a man like that left behind? The law office smelled of leather and printer toner, the kind of cold that came from marble floors, even in never turned off. The grief Ren sat with her hands folded in her lap, because there was nowhere else to put them. That had cost Roland to learn. A charcoal suit that had cost, she would later learn, $1,200, and a Rolex he checked twice before the lawyer had taken longer than he'd planned. Once because the reading was taking longer than he'd planned for. The numbers came first. $610,000 in investment accounts that had the family and clean went to Roland. His father's side of the family. Settled and twins. A deed. Castellane salvage of town, called Castellane Salvage and Iron, condemned by the county 2 years earlier. And Roland laughed, not cruelly. That was the person laughs at stay with her, he laughed the way at. The parts at something obvious. Let the girls at, correcting himself without looking up from the paper he was signing. Sorry. The twins have the scrap heap. It's about the only thing in this family suited to what they're worth. Ren said nothing. She had learned this year that silence cost nothing and revealed less. The lawyer, almost as an afterthought, slid a small tin box of the shipping manifest. He said, "No note attached." Inside was a brass as cloth. The paper gone soft as cloth. Roland didn't glance at it, and, guide to sim. He had already moved on to the next signature, the next number, the only kind of inheritance it ever thought to ask about. Outside. Outside in the parking lot. Ren sat in her car with the heater manifest carefully, the way she'd been taught to handle anything her grandfather had touched. In the margin, in his handwriting, worn but legible, were 7 words. In the Findlay Cove. Ask for what's under the 3rd gate. But she had never heard of Findlay Cove, Bentley couldn't 3 days before her next shift, and fight mine nothing on a place that might mine at all. 340 miles east. The road ran out of gas stations, before it ran out of coastline. Ren slept once outside Youngstown, in the driver's seat with the heater off, because a motel would have cost $38 she didn't have a place to take from. She smelled Findlay Cove before she saw it. Low tide and diesel rust. the particular smell of salt water that had been sitting on metal for a very long time. The gulls were louder than she expected, closer, circling something she couldn't yet identify. The November air came off the water the moment she stepped out of the car, and under her fingers the padlock on the gate was rough with orange rust, flaking at her touch like old paint. Only then did she let herself look at the yard, 11 acres of it, collapsed sheet metal sheds folded in on themselves, rusted hull sections stacked and forgotten, a crane frozen mid-lift, exactly where it had stopped working, decades ago by the look of it, and never touched since. The county photos until you were standing in it. Nothing captured hadn't nefus. She checked the fence line twice and found no gap it wasn't chained. For a moment she stood there with her hand. No gate still on the cold metal, considering the 340 miles behind her and the $10 in her tank for the drive back. Her grandfather had never once, in 19 years of her one-inch box, a tool down. She climbed the fence instead, called the third gate. She heard something the wind couldn't count for. Metallic 4 feet. A low, metallic groan, rising from somewhere beneath her feet, and then, again, she stopped walking. The gulls had gone quiet. The sound came a third time, and this time she followed it, past 2 collapsed sheds, and this to a stretch of concrete floor that didn't match anything around it. Newer, smoother, poured long after the rust had already claimed everything else. The brass key in her pocket suddenly felt heavier than a key had any right to feel. The concrete gave up its secret one blister at a time. She worked to the seam where the newer pour met the old, and when that failed she found a pipe wrench in the nearest shed, rusted but solid, her palm split open along the same lines. She stopped noticing, twice before she stopped noticing. What she uncovered, finally, scraping away decades of grit with her bare fingers, was a steel hatch, flush with the ground, exactly the size a person could pass through, was the first stage, beneath the grime, a keyhole. The anomaly, confirmed. Beneath into her pocket, she already knew before she reached into her pocket what would fit it. The brass key turned, but the hatch didn't move. Rust had swollen it somewhere in the decades since anyone had behind it. She wedged the tire iron under the rim and put her full weight behind it, and the metal screamed against metal, until it gave all at once, and she felt in her back teeth, and she nearly went in after it. The cold air came up first, mineral and old, the smell of stone that had never once seen sunlight. Then water, somewhere below, dripping in a rhythm too even to be anything but patient. A cold that had nothing to do with November. A cold that belonged only to this hole in the ground, and let it show her what her other senses had already promised. Her Tari promised. A vault, the size of a 2-car garage, poured in concrete, lined on 3 sides with wooden crates, stencil lettering gone soft with age. She went very still. She pried the nearest crate open with the same tire iron, and the wood came apart easily, tired of holding on. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle, were gold bars, each stamped with a naval registry number she didn't yet understand. She did not gasp twice the way she counted them. Why, she counted everything now. A second manifest, tucked beneath the crates, explained what her hands were already holding. In 1943, from the SS Cushion along this coast, had run a private salvage operation along this coast, and had recovered cargo from the SS Corwin Hale, a freighter torpedo that paid the claim before the wreck was found, which meant the gold, once recovered and belonged to no one on paper. Reporting it would have opened a dispute. Swallerton Heath sewed here instead in her manifest. A letter, in her grandfather's hand, ink faded, but legible. Beneath the manifest, it named Roland's father as the one once to sell this location to a rival salvage outfit behind the family's back. It said, plainly, only one who still asked me questions about that yard. That's why it's yours. It instructed her to find the Origin Maritime office before she moved a single bar. Not to the estate, but to 4471, tied not to the estate, but to whoever held the deed. She was still holding the letter when headlights swept across the yard from the road outside. She had been here, apparently, where she'd gone, except, apparently, someone did. But the fence rattled behind her before she'd even turned off the flashlight, but he came over it, in a coat too clean for a scrapyard. But he came over it. Second to a flashlight beam cutting across the crates before it found her face. He wasn't out of breath. That was the detail she noticed first. That a man who golfed for a living had so much defense at midnight, without so much as raising his pulse. A friend of mine at the County Records office plays a Tuesday round with me, he said. Conversational, as if they were finishing a conversation rather than starting one. He flagged your name this morning, said someone was asking about Findlay Cove. The cold had gotten into her hands hours ago and hadn't left. She said nothing. Roland crouched near the oak climbing and straightened again, unhurried. The deed transfer has 11 days, won't clear for another 11 die. Leans until it does. Anything found on this property belongs to the estate's residual account, which is me. He told her Tifi she had until sunrise to hand over whatever she'd found, or he'd report her for trespassing on a condemned site. Have the county seal the gate before proof she'd ever been inside it at all. She didn't argue. Arguing cost something she didn't have tonight. Instead, her grief, she ran through what she Actuther's hand, a registry number exactly looked up yet. Manifest she hadn't other's hand, a letter that told her exactly where to look next. And one thing Roland had just said, without meaning to, he had known where to send his friend to check. He had known enough to climb worthless, yes, in front of a room full of lawyers. He had never once believed that. Roland smiled the same easy smile from the law office. You have nothing to bargain with the fence, and started back shut behind him, the padlock clicking closed from the wrong side. The padlock's a king. What sweet. Wren looked down at the manifest still folded in her hand. Then she looked up at the gate he had just locked. From the outside, when the key had always been hers, at 6 in the morning, the manifest gave her one more thing Roland had never bothered to look for, to the County Maritime Records office, printed small at the bottom of past the first paragraph. A direct. The archivist who answered sounded like someone who'd been doing this job since before Wren was born. Unhurried, thorough. Exactly the kind of person Roland's golfing friend on the general line would never think to transfer her to. Wren gave the number. C4 pulled the wine. The registry had never closed. Filed in 1943. Never amended. Didn't follow the estate. They followed the deed. They followed the deed. Whoever held the deed to the property held the register. The archivist offered to email a confirmation. That Wren asked her to print it and read it aloud first, just to be certain she'd heard it right. Roland came back at dawn with a quiet handoff company, the kind who show up expecting a quiet handoff and a truck to load. He was already talking before he'd finished climbing the fence, something about paperwork, about patience, about being reasonable. Wren handed him the printed page instead of answering. She watched him read it. She watched the exact moment his eyes reached the line that mattered. Attaches to current deed holder of record. And something in his face, the same face that had laughed at her across a conference table, went completely still. His 2 men had already caught the other words on the page. Federal Maritime Jurisdict's claim. They exchanged one look between them, and took a step back from the crates without being asked. The particular retreat of men who understood, faster than their employ out the gate. Roland didn't say anix. Roland didn't say anything. Wren did. You said the scrap heap suited what were, not needing to. Turns out you were the only one in the family who never bothered to check. One of the 2 men would mention that line. Weeks later, you said to a reporter covering the county's reopened inquiry into the wartime salvage claim. Not because it was Wren anything, but the kind of thing you don't forget hearing. Roland left without answering. He didn't climb the fence this time, and for once he was the one who left it standing open behind him. Nothing was finished. Insurance inquiry was only beginning. Yet, not the claim, not the registry, not the question of what would happen to everything siniting as that vault, but Wren stepped through the same gate an hour later. The tin stum box tucked under her arm, and for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she wasn't walking away from anything at all. She was toward it. 6 months later, the ruling came down in 4 sentences, and it took the county less than a paragraph to say what mattered most. The recovery rights had always belonged to the deed holder of record, and the deed holder of record was Wren Castellane. Roland Pruitt did not attend the hearing. By then he was already answering questions of his own, a formal inquiry into his to sell salvage rights he'd never owned. Quietly, opened the Great Tweetseek the insurance case did. He lost his executorship over what remained of the family's holdings within a matter of weeks. He left Marlow Station before the year was out, and no one at the diner where Wren used to work ever mentioned seeing him again. The scrapyard didn't stay a scrapyard. Wren, 20 now, 4 in Zonta B's on the recovery, brother among's on the payroll. Her brother Dale running a marine salvage and historical recovery at once condemned, and everyone else had called worthless. She kept the brass compass on her desk. She had not mounted on a wall somewhere for people displaying it would have. On a clear morning that spring, she stood down. She stood the 3rd gate. She stood at the 3rd gate, repainted now, standing open, the padlock replaced with one she controlled the key to. The light came off the water behind her, nothing like the fluorescent glare of a diner counter at 10 minutes to 6. No one had ever asked what the yard was worth. They had only asked what it looked like from the road. Wren was the only one in her question who had understood, from the very beginning, that those were rarely the same question at all.